The woman adjusted the worn strap of her bag over her shoulder as she walked along Faria Avenue, her measured and firm steps contrasting with her humble appearance. The afternoon sun reflected off the mirrored buildings, creating a play of light and shadow that she knew by heart after so many months, following the same route. Miriam, as she was known by the few who deigned to speak to her, stopped in front of the corporate building number 1500, lifting her eyes to the 40th floor. From his luxurious office up high, Robert Alton observed the same scene that had been repeating for months. That woman intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. Her grey hair always pulled back in the same bun, her tattered but clean clothes, and especially that gaze that seemed to see through the smoked glass walls. He stepped away from the window, irritated with himself for wasting precious time watching some beggar. "Mr. Alcantara, your 3 o'clock meeting has arrived," announced Helen, his secretary, entering the office after a discreet knock at the door. The 50-year-old woman had worked with him for 2 decades and knew every nuance of his mood. "The contract for the land development in Greenwood is ready for review." Robert waved distractedly, still lost in thoughts about the figure below. "Helen, have you noticed that woman who always hangs around here, the one with grey hair?" The secretary approached the window, following her boss's gaze. "Yes, sir. She showed up about 6 months ago. The local merchants say she is polite and speaks well. Some even comment that she understands art when she stops in front of the galleries." "Curious," murmured Robert, adjusting his Italian tie. "A beggar who understands art." Meanwhile, Miriam continued her walk, stopping briefly in front of Galleria Vermelho. Through the glass, she observed the new contemporary art exhibition, her eyes analyzing every detail of the displayed works. The security guard of the gallery, accustomed to her presence, waved cordially. "Good afternoon, Ms. Miriam. Enjoying the new exhibition?" "It's an interesting interpretation of the neo-concretist movement," she replied, her voice carrying a refined St. Paul accent that contrasted with her appearance. "Although I think the artist got a bit lost in the execution of the third piece." The guard laughed, shaking his head. He had grown used to the insightful comments of that peculiar lady. Miriam continued her path, passing by the cafe where the aroma of specialty coffee mingled with the perfume of the gardenias in the vertical garden that adorned the facade of the corporate building. In the office, Robert tried to concentrate on the meeting, but his mind wandered. Something about that woman bothered him deeply, awakening feelings he preferred to keep buried. Maybe it was the way she walked with dignity despite her circumstances, or how her eyes seemed to hold secrets he couldn't decipher. "Mr. Alcantara," the lawyer's voice brought him back to reality. "About the clauses in the contract." "Yes, of course," Robert straightened in his leather chair. "Go on." But while the lawyer spoke about square meters and market values, Robert found himself remembering his own childhood in Redwood Hollow, when his mother sewed late into the night to provide for the family. Memories he had struggled so hard to erase, replacing them with diplomas from prestigious universities and million-dollar contracts. Miriam, on her part, had found her usual spot in the square in front of the business complex. She sat on the concrete bench, pulling out a daily economic newspaper from her bag. Her eyes scanned the news about mergers and acquisitions, market indices, and sector analyses with the familiarity of someone who had once breathed that world. Charles, the security guard of the building where Robert maintained his empire, approached during his round. A man of solid principles, born and raised in the same humble neighborhood from which Robert had emerged, Charles felt a growing discomfort as he observed the stark contrast between the luxury of the building and the poverty surrounding it. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?" Miriam looked up from the newspaper, a gentle smile lighting up her time-worn face. "Good afternoon, Charles. Just catching up on the market. Did you know that Petrobras shares rose 3% this week?" Charles scratched his head, surprised. "You understand these things?" "Let's say I had my days of glory," she answered enigmatically, carefully folding the newspaper. But that was in another life. From his office, Robert had returned to his observation post by the window. The meeting had ended, leaving him with a sense of emptiness that no million-dollar contract could fill. He watched Miriam talking to Charles, and something in his chest tightened. Why did that woman affect him so much? Helen entered the office again, bringing a tray with coffee. "Sir, may I make a comment?" Robert nodded affirmatively, still observing the scene below. "You've been watching that lady a lot. If I may say, it seems that something about her disturbs you." Robert turned abruptly. "Don't be ridiculous, Helen. Why would some beggar disturb me?" But Helen knew her boss too well to be intimidated. "Maybe because she represents something you're trying to forget. We all have a past, Mr. Alcantara." "Enough!" Robert's voice echoed through the office. "I have more important things to worry about than some beggar." Helen left quietly, but not before casting one last worried glance at the man she admired, professionally, but whose transformation over the years saddened her deeply. That afternoon, Miriam decided to visit the public library in the neighborhood. The historic building, with its preserved architecture, was one of her favorite refuges. The librarian, already accustomed to her presence, greeted her warmly. "Ms. Miriam, I managed to set aside those documents about the economic history of St. Paul that you requested." "Thank you, dear," Miriam replied, her eyes sparkling with anticipation, especially the real estate records from the last 3 decades. As Miriam immersed herself in the documents, analyzing transactions and market movements with an experienced gaze, Robert was attending another board meeting. The topic was the acquisition of a new plot of land in the South Zone, an area that promised exponential appreciation in the coming years. "The region has potential," one of the directors commented, "but we need to act quickly before the competition catches on to the opportunity." Robert nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The mention of the South Zone brought back unwanted memories of his childhood, of the small shack where he lived with his mother, and the sacrifices she made for him to study. Sacrifices he had repaid with distance and coldness, ashamed of his humble origins. Days passed in a routine that became almost ritualistic. Miriam continued her walks, her visits to the library, her contemplative pauses in front of the art galleries. Robert continued to watch her from his office, his curiosity slowly turning into obsession. It was Helen who brought the first concrete information. "Mr. Alcantara, the driver discovered something interesting about that lady. It seems she speaks French fluently. He heard her talking to a tourist the other day, giving directions and recommendations about museums in the city." "French?" Robert frowned. "A polyglot beggar?" "And that's not all," Helen continued. "The library staff said she has impressive knowledge about local economic history. She spends hours studying old documents, especially about real estate transactions." Alarm went off in Robert's mind. Real estate transactions? Why would a beggar be interested in that? A suspicion began to form, but he quickly pushed it aside. That would be too much of a coincidence. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. Lying in his king-size bed in the penthouse with a view of the entire city, he found himself thinking about Miriam. Who was she really? Why had she chosen that specific neighborhood for her wanderings? And why did she demonstrate such knowledge in such specific areas? The next day, he made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. He called his private investigator, a discreet and efficient man he had used on other occasions, to check the backgrounds of potential business partners. "I want you to investigate this woman," he ordered, showing a photo he had discreetly taken from the window. "Everything about her. Past, present, what brought her here." As the gears of the investigation began to turn, Miriam continued her seemingly simple routine. But that day, something different happened. Passing through the lobby of Robert's building, she stopped and began observing the panel displaying the companies housed there. Her eyes fixed on the name Alcantara Real Estate, and an enigmatic smile appeared on her lips. Charles, who was making his rounds, noticed her interest. "Do you know any companies here, Miss Miriam?" "Maybe," she replied softly. "Or maybe I knew the people behind them. Time has a way of changing many things, doesn't it, Charles?" The guard nodded, not fully understanding the meaning of those words. Miriam resumed her walk, leaving behind more questions than answers. In the office, Robert was receiving a preliminary report from the investigator. The information was scarce and contradictory. Miriam Silvera, approximately 60 years old, with no known fixed address. But there was something more. Old records mentioned an M. Silvera working at a financial consulting firm that had gone bankrupt about 15 years ago. Could be a coincidence, Robert murmured to himself. But something inside him said it wasn't. The mentioned firm had been a direct competitor of his at the beginning of his career. Its sudden bankruptcy had released several strategic properties onto the market, properties that Robert had acquired for a pittance and that formed the foundation of his empire. The connection was tenuous but disturbing. Was it possible that this beggar was the same brilliant consultant who had almost thwarted his rise years ago? And if so, what was she doing there, haunting his building day after day? Determined to uncover the truth, Robert began planning his next move. He didn't yet know it, but he was about to embark on a journey that would force him to confront not only Miriam's past, but also his own, and the questionable choices he had made to get where he was. That October afternoon, with the sky heavy, promising rain, Miriam was sitting on her usual bench when she noticed unusual movement in the building. Executives were rushing in and out, and she could feel the tension in the air. Something important was happening in Robert Alton's empire. What she didn't know was that Robert had just made a crucial mistake in a negotiation, nearly losing a 50 million reais contract. The mistake: a failure to analyze market trends, exactly the type of insight that an experienced consultant would have identified immediately. Frustrated and angry with himself, Robert returned to the window. Miriam was there, reading her newspaper as always, but this time she lifted her eyes, and for a brief moment their gazes met across the distance. It was as if she knew exactly what had happened, as if she could read his frustration and understand his failure. In that instant, Robert made an impulsive decision that would define the next chapters of their intertwined lives. He would invite her to dinner, not out of kindness or genuine curiosity, but from a dark desire to prove to himself and others the abyss that separated them. Little did he know he was about to discover that some abysses are illusions created by those who are afraid to see the truth. Robert personally descended to the street, something he rarely did. A fine drizzle had begun to fall, creating a damp veil over the city. He approached Miriam with determined steps, his impeccable suit contrasting with her simple clothes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, "I would like to invite you to dinner at my penthouse, next Friday at 8 o'clock. Miriam slowly looked up from the newspaper, studying the man in front of her. Robert expected to see surprise, perhaps intimidation, but found only a disconcerting calm. "And why would Mr. Robert Alton be inviting a beggar to dinner?" she asked, her voice carrying a subtle irony that caught him off guard. "Do you know who I am?" "Everyone in this neighborhood knows who you are, Mr. Alcantara. The question is, do you know who you really are?" The question hit him like a punch. Robert swallowed hard, quickly regaining his composure. "Friday, 8 o'clock, my driver will come to pick you up here." "I accept your invitation," Miriam replied simply, "but I hope you are prepared for the consequences." Robert turned and returned to the building, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold drizzle. What consequences could she be suggesting? In the days that followed, Robert dove into preparations for the dinner. He invited his most influential and snobbish friends, people he knew would not hesitate to judge someone outside their social circle. He planned an elaborate menu with dishes that required refined etiquette knowledge. Every detail was thought out to create maximum discomfort and exposure. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Helen asked while reviewing the guest list. "Some of these people are particularly cruel." "That's exactly why I chose them," Robert replied, coldly. "I want to see how she behaves outside her natural habitat." Helen left the room shaking her head, her heart aching for the transformation of the man she once admired. The Robert she had known at the beginning of his career had ambition, yes, but he also had compassion. Now it seemed that success had eroded his humanity. Miriam, for her part, spent the week in her usual routine, but with one addition. She visited a small thrift store in the center, where a friend kept some special pieces for her. She chose a vintage navy silk dress, impeccably preserved. The owner of the thrift store, knowing her story, offered to make small adjustments for free. "Are you going somewhere special, Miriam?" "I'm going to revisit the past," she answered enigmatically. "Sometimes it's necessary for us to move forward." At the library, Miriam intensified her research. The documents she was studying were now more specific. Records of corporate bankruptcies, property transfers, old contracts. The librarian watched curiously, but respected the privacy of that mysterious lady who demonstrated such deep knowledge. Charles, the security guard, noticed the unusual activity. "Miss Miriam, people are saying that you were invited to dinner up there. Is it true?" "It is true, Charles. Sometimes destiny puts us in interesting situations." "Be careful," he advised, genuinely concerned. "Mr. Alcantara, he has changed a lot since he built this empire. He's no longer the same boy from Redwood Hollow." "Nobody stays the same, Charles. The question is whether we change for better or worse." The night before the dinner, Robert had a disturbing dream. He dreamed of his mother, sewing under the dim light of the only lamp in their shack. She looked up, tired, and asked, "Was it for this that I sacrificed everything, son? For you to become someone who humiliates others?" He woke up sweating, heart racing. He pushed the dream from his mind, focusing on the final preparations. The penthouse was impeccable, carefully lit artworks, a table set with fine china, crystals reflecting the light from imported chandeliers. The guests began to arrive punctually. Business people, socialites, people who measured others by their bank balance. Robert greeted them with his practiced smile, the perfect host in his element. "Robert, dear," cooed a jewel-covered socialite, "I heard we will have a special guest tonight. Is it true you invited a beggar?" "Let's say we'll have an interesting anthropological experience," he replied, provoking laughter among the group. At 8 o'clock sharp, the intercom announced Miriam's arrival. Robert felt a morbid anticipation, imagining the reaction of his guests when she walked in wearing her tattered clothes. But when the elevator doors opened, the silence that fell over the room was of an entirely different nature than expected. Miriam emerged like an apparition from St. Paul's elegant past. The vintage dress fit perfectly, her hair was styled in a sophisticated bun, and she carried a small evening bag that completed the look perfectly. More impressive still was her posture. She entered the space as if she belonged there, greeting each person with the exact measure of cordiality and formality. When the waiter offered champagne, she accepted it naturally, holding the glass correctly and making a casual comment about the harvest. Robert watched, astonished. This was not the reaction he had planned. The guests, initially prepared for the promised spectacle, found themselves genuinely charmed by Miriam's intelligent conversation and evident culture. During dinner, she navigated the complex etiquette of multiple utensils without hesitation. When the conversation turned to contemporary art, she contributed insightful observations about the works displayed on the walls. When the topic shifted to economics, she demonstrated up-to-date knowledge about market trends. "You seem very well informed for," one of the guests began, leaving the sentence unfinished. "For a beggar?" Miriam completed with a serene smile. "Life's circumstances don't always reflect the totality of a person, do you agree?" It was then that she dropped the first bomb of the night, casually mentioning her experience as a financial consultant. "I spent many years analyzing real estate market trends. It's fascinating how some fortunes are built on the ruins of others' dreams." Robert choked on his wine. The insinuation was subtle but clear to him. Some guests, less perceptive, continued the conversation without noticing the growing tension between host and special guest. Dinner continued with Miriam revealing piece by piece fragments of a past that began to form a disturbing picture. She mentioned specific projects, dates that coincided with crucial moments in Robert's rise, always with the subtlety of someone who knows the power of unspoken words. When the main course ended, and the guests moved to the sitting area for digestives and coffee, Robert found himself alone with Miriam on the terrace. The nighttime view of St. Paul stretched out before them, millions of lights twinkling like terrestrial stars. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, abandoning any pretense of cordiality. "Doing what exactly?" Miriam replied, gazing at the city. "Accepting your invitation? Showing that not all your prejudices are justified?" "Do you know what I'm talking about? The insinuations? The references to the past?" Miriam turned to face him, and for the first time, Robert saw the depth of pain in her eyes. You really don't recognize me, do you? Miriam Silvera, senior consultant at Horizonte Investimentos, the woman who almost thwarted your first big acquisition because she identified irregularities in the documentation. The blood drained from Robert's face. Horizonte Investimentos, the firm that had suddenly gone bankrupt, releasing strategic properties that he had acquired. The brilliant consultant who had been his main adversary in negotiations. But you... How did I end up on the streets? Miriam laughed bitterly. When you lose everything overnight, when contracts are mysteriously cancelled and reputations are destroyed by well-placed rumors, options become limited. The truth began to unfold before Robert like a macabre puzzle. He had been so focused on winning, on building his empire, that he had never stopped to think about the human wreckage left behind. I didn't know. Did you not know, or did you not want to know? Miriam challenged. How many lives did you destroy in your climb to the top, Robert? How many people like me became acceptable collateral damage? At that moment, Helen appeared at the terrace door. Mr. Alcantara, your guests are asking for you. Robert mechanically waved, still processing the revelations. Miriam straightened her shoulders and walked back into the hall with the same elegance with which she had arrived. The rest of the night passed in a blur for Robert. He watched Miriam interact with her guests, now seeing clearly the intelligence and sophistication he had tried to ignore. Some of the attendees began to ask more specific questions about her professional experience, and her answers painted the portrait of a brilliant professional who had been unjustly excluded from the market. When the night finally ended and the guests began to say their goodbyes, many insisted on exchanging contacts with Miriam, genuinely interested in her perspectives on the market. The dinner that was supposed to humiliate her had turned into her silent triumph. Alone with Robert again, Miriam prepared to leave. Thank you for dinner. It was enlightening to revisit this world. Wait, Robert stopped her. We need to talk about the past, about what happened. Do we need to? Miriam tilted her head. Or do you need to ease your conscience? Please. Something in the sudden vulnerability of his voice made her pause. All right. But not here. Not in this sanctuary of luxury built on lies. If you want to talk to me, come to my world, public library, tomorrow at 10. After she left, Robert was alone in his penthouse, surrounded by all the symbols of his success that suddenly seemed empty. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly remember those early days, the questionable maneuvers, the forged contracts, the destroyed reputations. Helen, who had stayed behind to oversee the cleanup, approached him. It was an interesting night. You knew, Robert asked, about who she was? I suspected, the way she spoke, the knowledge she displayed. I did some research on my own. And you didn't tell me anything. Helen sighed. You needed to find out for yourself. You needed to look her in the eyes and see the reflection of what you have become. That night, Robert did not sleep. He spent hours going through old files, contracts from the time of Horizonte's bankruptcy. The more he searched, the more evidence he found of his own involvement in the company's downfall. It hadn't been illegal, technically, but it had been immoral. Rumors planted, pressure in the right places, manipulations bordering on extortion. The next day, he arrived at the public library 15 minutes early. The contrast with his usual environment was striking. Dusty shelves, worn furniture, but a treasure trove of knowledge carefully preserved. Miriam was already there, surrounded by piles of documents. She looked up as he approached, indicating the chair in front of her. Punctuality, that's new for you. Robert sat down awkwardly. Miriam, Before you start with empty apologies, she interrupted him. Let me show you something. She pushed a folder in his direction. Original documents, contracts, opinions, analyses I did at the time, all proving that the properties you acquired had legal issues that were conveniently resolved after our bankruptcy. Robert flipped through the papers, his face paling with each page. How did you manage to keep this? I've always been meticulous. When I realized what was happening, I made copies of everything, not out of revenge, but out of a sense of justice that might one day be necessary. Why didn't you sue me? Why didn't you make this public?" Miriam laughed bitterly. "With what? Money? With what support? You had just destroyed my credibility, my company, my life. Who would believe a failed ex-executive against the new prodigy of the real estate market?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of truths unspoken for years. Robert struggled to find words that didn't sound pathetic in light of the magnitude of what he had done. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked. "What do I want?" Miriam reflected. "For a long time, I wanted justice. Then I wanted revenge. But do you know what I discovered living on the streets, watching people like you from the outside? I discovered that the real punishment for men like you doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, at the moment they finally see who they have become." "I can make it up to you," Robert offered desperately. I can pay?" Miriam shook her head. "Do you think this is about money? Robert, I lost more than just assets. I lost faith in humanity, in justice, in everything I believed in. Can you pay for that?" Robert sank into the chair, the weight of his actions finally hitting him squarely. "So why are you here? Why accept to meet me?" "Because," Miriam said softly, "I believe in second chances. Not for me, my life has already been lived. But for you, there is still time. The question is, what are you going to do with that time?" In the weeks that followed, Robert found himself in a spiral of painful self-discovery. Conversations with Miriam at the library became regular, each meeting revealing more layers of their shared past. She never spared him the truth, but she also didn't delight in his suffering. "Do you know what the irony was?" Miriam said in one of those meetings. "I had identified an incredible partnership opportunity between our companies. We could have built something great together, but you chose destruction over construction." Robert began to change. First, it was small things. He treated Helen with more respect, listened to his employees' suggestions, stopped to chat with Charles during his rounds. Then came bigger changes. He reviewed old contracts, looking for other potential victims of his predatory practices. "You're different," Helen observed one day. "More human." "Is it too late for this?" Robert asked genuinely. "It's never too late for redemption, sir. The question is what we do with it." Miriam, in turn, began to reveal more about her life on the streets. It hadn't just been survival. It had been a conscious choice to remain in that neighborhood, documenting business practices, helping others who had been harmed by the system. "You've become a kind of guardian," Robert observed during one of their meetings. "Someone needs to watch the watchers," she replied. "How many others do what you did, thinking there will never be consequences?" It was then that Miriam revealed the true extent of her documentation. It wasn't just papers about her own company. She had compiled evidence of various questionable practices in the St. Paul real estate market, including Robert's. Robert swallowed hard. "This could destroy half the market." "Including you," Miriam confirmed. "The question is, what will we do with this?" "We? You didn't think I was doing this alone, did you? There are others like me, Robert. People who lost everything but haven't lost hope for justice. We formed an informal network, documenting, waiting for the right moment." The revelation was staggering. Robert realized he had completely underestimated Miriam and others like her. They were not passive victims. They were agents of change waiting for their opportunity. "And what is the right moment?" he asked. "Maybe," Miriam suggested, "the moment when someone from within the system decides it's time to change it. Someone with enough power and influence to make a difference." The implicit suggestion was clear. Robert had a choice: to continue being part of the problem or to become part of the solution. It was a decision that would require sacrificing much of what he had built, but perhaps in the process reclaim something far more valuable: his soul. In the days that followed, Robert began to implement subtle changes in his business practices. He refused deals he would have embraced without question before, insisted on transparency in his transactions, and started developing projects with real social impact. His partners and investors noticed the change and didn't like it. "You're getting soft, Alcantara," one of them said during a tense meeting. "Since when do we care about social impact? Since when did we realize that sustainable businesses are long-lasting businesses? Robert replied firmly. Miriam watched these changes with cautious interest. During their meetings at the library, she challenged him to go deeper, not to settle for cosmetic changes. True reform hurts, she said. It requires real sacrifice, not just symbolic gestures. Then Robert made a decision that surprised even Miriam. He announced the creation of a reparations fund, aimed at compensating individuals and businesses harmed by predatory practices in the real estate market, starting with those he himself had harmed. This is going to cost a fortune, Miriam observed. Maybe it's the price of redemption, Robert replied. But the true test of his transformation came when Miriam finally revealed the most important document of all, proof that she still held legal stakes in several of the properties that formed the basis of Robert's empire. Documents that had been lost during the bankruptcy, but that she had carefully preserved. You could have destroyed me at any time, Robert realized, stunned. Destruction was never my goal, Miriam explained. I wanted justice, yes, but more than that, I wanted to see if transformation was possible, if someone like you could choose a different path. Robert spent sleepless nights analyzing the documents, consulting lawyers, calculating the impact. Acknowledging Miriam's rights would mean giving up a significant portion of his fortune. But it would also mean finally building something on honest foundations. The decision, when it came, surprised even Helen, who thought she knew all sides of her boss. Robert not only acknowledged Miriam's rights, he went further, proposing a partnership to transform those properties into projects with real social impact. You have the knowledge and the vision, he told Miriam during what would be their last meeting at the library. I have the resources and the contacts. Together, we can do something truly meaningful. Miriam studied the man before her, searching for signs of the business predator she had known years ago. Instead, she found something rare in the corporate world, genuine humility and a desire for reparation. It's going to be difficult, she warned. Your partners will resist. The market will question. You could lose much of what you've built. Maybe, Robert agreed, but I will gain something that money could never buy, the ability to look in the mirror without turning my eyes away. The transformation of the business neighborhood began slowly. The first project was a vocational training center built on one of the lots that had belonged to Horizonte. Miriam personally oversaw every detail, ensuring that the space truly served the community. Charles, the security guard, was one of the first to benefit, participating in security management courses that qualified him for more responsible positions. I never thought I would see this day, he told Miriam. Mr. Alcantara really changed. People can surprise, Miriam replied, when they have the opportunity and choose the right path. Helen became a key player in the new structure, using her years of experience to ensure that social projects were managed as well as commercial ventures. It's like working in a completely different company, she commented. But the resistance was real and fierce. Investors pulled out capital, partners threatened lawsuits, competitors tried to take advantage of what they saw as weakness. Robert faced each challenge with a determination that Miriam recognized, the same one he had used to build his empire, now directed toward a greater purpose. Aren't you regretting it? Miriam asked during one particularly difficult meeting where they had lost yet another important investor. Regretting, Robert reflected. I'm regretting taking so long to do the right thing. The second project was even more ambitious, transforming an underutilized office complex into affordable housing for workers in the city center. It was Miriam who had the idea, remembering how many people like her had lost not only jobs but homes when companies went bankrupt. The media began to notice the transformation. Articles questioned whether it was a marketing strategy or a genuine change. Miriam and Robert faced the cameras together, she with the authority of someone who had lived on the streets, he with the humility of someone who had learned from his mistakes. We don't expect you to believe in words, Robert said in an interview. Judge us by the results, by the lives changed, by the opportunities created. The third project touched even deeper into the wounds of the past, a microcredit fund for small entrepreneurs, many of whom had been pushed out of the market by predatory practices. Miriam insisted that the first beneficiaries be former employees, though of Horizonte, who were still struggling to re-establish themselves. It was during the inauguration of this project that Robert reunited with his mother, whom he had distanced himself from out of shame for his origins. Miriam had secretly invited her, knowing that no transformation would be complete without this reunion. "My son," the woman said, tears in her eyes, "I finally recognize you again." The embrace between mother and son, amidst a hall full of people who had been both victims and beneficiaries of the transformation, symbolized more than a personal reconciliation. It was the closing of a cycle, the acknowledgement that success without humanity is failure disguised as victory. 6 months after that first dinner in the penthouse, the business neighborhood had visibly transformed. Where there had once been only the coldness of concrete and glass, there were now community spaces, vertical gardens accessible to the public, ongoing training programs. Miriam no longer lived on the streets, but chose a modest apartment in the same neighborhood from where she could oversee the projects and continue her advocacy work. "Wealth was never my goal," she explained to Robert. "Purpose always was." Robert, for his part, discovered that the reduction in his personal fortune had been compensated by something unexpected, genuine respect. Not the respect bought by fear or interest, but the acknowledgement of a community that saw in him someone committed to real change. "Do you know what's ironic?" he said to Miriam during one of their morning coffees, now a weekly tradition. "I'm doing better business now. It seems that integrity attracts quality partners." "Who would have thought?" Miriam replied with a smile that mixed irony and genuine affection. The most significant moment came when they received an unexpected visit, representatives from other companies wanting to understand and replicate the model. What had started as a personal journey of confrontation and redemption was becoming a larger movement. "You proved it's possible," said a young entrepreneur. "That success and social responsibility are not mutually exclusive." Miriam and Robert exchanged glances. It was exactly what she had said years ago, before the fall of Horizonte. The difference was that now there was someone willing to listen and act. On the anniversary of the fateful dinner, they organized an event on the terrace of the penthouse. No longer a symbol of ostentation, but transformed into a community space. Beneficiaries of the projects, social investors, workers, all mixed in a celebration that would have been unthinkable years before. Charles, now security manager for the entire social complex, gave an emotional speech. "This place taught me that walls can be torn down, not with force, but with understanding." Helen, coordinating the new educational projects, added, "I worked 20 years watching wealth accumulate. It's liberating to work, to see it distributed with purpose." When it was Miriam's turn to speak, silence took over the terrace. "I spent years on the streets of this neighborhood observing, documenting, waiting. Waiting not for revenge, but for the moment when someone would choose to do differently. Robert gave me more than financial reparations. He proved that transformation is possible." Robert, for his part, kept it brief. "Miriam taught me that true power does not lie in tearing others down, but in building bridges. That success measured only in numbers is failure disguised as victory. Today our numbers may be smaller, but our impact is infinitely greater." The night progressed with music, shared food, transformation stories. From the same terrace where one day Robert had planned to humiliate Miriam, now stood a testimony that second chances, when embraced with sincerity, can rewrite destinies. But the story didn't end there. In the following months, the model they developed began to be studied in universities, replicated in other cities, debated in business forums. What had started as a personal story of confrontation and redemption had become a case study on real corporate responsibility. Miriam was invited to teach about business ethics, her unique experience offering perspectives that no traditional academic could provide. Robert became a consultant for companies wanting to transition to more sustainable and fair models. "It's strange," Robert commented during one of their meetings. "I lost half of my fortune, but I feel richer than ever." "Because you are," Miriam replied. "Real wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in the legacy we leave behind. Their legacy continued to grow. The training center graduated its first class, with 80% of graduates finding dignified employment. The housing project welcomed its first families, including some former homeless people Miriam had met during her years on the streets. The microcredit fund had already supported dozens of small businesses, creating an ecosystem of conscious entrepreneurship. One morning, Robert found Miriam in the spot where she used to sit years ago on the bench in front of the building. But now, instead of reading newspapers about a world from which she had been excluded, she was reviewing reports on the projects she helped coordinate. "Sometimes it's still surreal," she admitted, "how everything changed. It changed because you never gave up," Robert said. "Even when it would have been easier to just disappear, you stayed, observed, waited for the right moment." "And you," Miriam countered, "could have continued on your path, ignoring everything. But you chose to look, to question, to change. That requires a courage that few have." They sat in silence, watching the movement of the neighborhood they had helped transform. Executives rushed down the sidewalks alongside students from the training center. The cafe that once served only suited clients now welcomed a diversity that reflected true St. Paul. The deepest transformation, however, was invisible to the eyes. It was the network of people who had been touched by the story, inspired to question their own practices, to seek more ethical ways of success. Emails arrived daily from entrepreneurs wanting guidance, from victims of predatory practices seeking justice, from young professionals wanting to build purposeful careers. Robert created a mentoring program, sharing not only business strategies, but primarily the lessons learned in his journey of transformation. "The biggest mistake we make," he told the mentees, "is believing that success justifies any means. I am living proof that the means define the end." Miriam, in turn, formalized the informal network of documentation and advocacy that she had helped create during her years on the streets. What had started as a desperate effort for justice had become a robust organization for corporate accountability. In a particularly significant moment, they were approached by representatives of the former Horizonte, employees who had survived the bankruptcy and wanted to recount the company's story. With the support of Miriam and Robert, they created a memorial not only for the lost company, but for all victims of predatory business practices. "It's important to remember," Miriam said at the inauguration, "not to cultivate resentment, but to ensure that mistakes are not repeated." The memorial also included a section on transformation and redemption, showing that even those who caused harm can choose a different path. Robert contributed an honest testimony about his actions and the painful yet liberating process of acknowledging and rectifying them. 2 years after that first meeting in the rain, when Robert had stepped down from his pedestal to invite Miriam to dinner, they met again at the same location. But now, instead of an invitation laden with ill intentions, there was a solid partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "You saved more than my company," Robert said. "You saved my soul." "I saved nothing," Miriam gently corrected him. "I merely held up a mirror. You chose not to look away and to do something about what you saw." The rain began to fall again, just like that day 2 years ago. But instead of seeking shelter, they stayed there, letting the water symbolically wash away the last traces of the past. "Where do we go now?" Robert asked. "Forward," Miriam replied. "Always forward, but carrying the lessons of the past." In the years that followed, their partnership became a model studied globally. It was not just about corporate social responsibility. It was about the fundamental possibility of human change, about how power and awareness could coexist. Miriam never wanted to reclaim the luxurious life she had lost. Instead, she found purpose in ensuring that others would not go through what she had endured. Her influence grew not through material wealth, but through the respect earned by her, unwavering integrity. Robert discovered that leading with awareness not only did not harm his business, on the contrary, it attracted partners and opportunities that valued sustainability and ethics. His empire, rebuilt on solid foundations, became more resilient than ever. Helen, a witness to the entire transformation, often reflected on the journey. "It's as if they are two different companies, two different men," she said. "But in truth, the Robert I see today has always been there, buried under layers of misguided ambition. Charles, now a partner in social projects, added his perspective. Ms. Miriam always saw beyond appearances. She saw potential where others saw only ruin. That is what saved not only Mr. Robert, but all of us. The impact extended far beyond the business district. Public policies were influenced, laws regarding business practices were strengthened, and a new generation of entrepreneurs grew up with different values. What had started as an individual story had become a collective movement. At an international conference on business ethics, Miriam and Robert were invited to speak. The auditorium was packed not just with business people, but with students, activists, and people who had been impacted by predatory practices and now saw hope for change. Our story, Miriam began, is not unique. In every city, in every country, there are Marinas in the streets and Robertos in glass towers. The question is, how long will it take us to build bridges between these worlds? Robert continued. I learned that true success is not measured by what we accumulate, but by what we build for others. That real power is not in tearing down, but in lifting up. That the greatest courage is to admit mistakes and work tirelessly to rectify them. The audience's questions revealed the profound impact of their story. Young entrepreneurs wanted to know how to resist the pressure for profits at any cost. Victims of predatory practices sought paths to justice that were not just punitive but transformative. Investors questioned how to identify and support truly ethical businesses. We do not have all the answers, Miriam admitted, but we have one certainty. Change is possible when we choose to see humanity where before we saw only numbers. Back in St. Paul, the projects continued to flourish. The training center had expanded, offering not only technical courses but integral human development. The housing project had inspired more inclusive public housing policies. The microcredit fund had become self-sustaining, generating a virtuous cycle of conscious entrepreneurship. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was less tangible. The living proof that redemption is possible, that second chances can lead to first changes, that the chasm between worlds can be crossed when there is a genuine willingness from both sides. On a special afternoon, exactly 5 years after that first dinner, they organized a symbolic event. On the same terrace, with many of the same original guests, but now including beneficiaries of the projects, partners in transformation, and witnesses of change. 5 years ago, Robert began emotionally, I organized a dinner with the worst of intentions. I wanted to prove superiority, demonstrate distance, reinforce prejudices. Instead, I found my lost humanity. Miriam took the floor, and I accepted the invitation not out of necessity but out of hope. Hope that even hearts hardened by success can be touched by truth. Today we celebrate not only projects and numbers, but the human capacity for transformation. That night's dinner was different in every way. The same fine china now served a diverse array of guests. The same waiters were now partners in an events cooperative. The same terrace now hosted shared dreams instead of inflated egos. Among the guests was Robert's mother, proud of the son who had found himself again. There were former Horizonte employees, now thriving in new ventures. Charles was there, no longer as a security guard, but as the director of social operations. Helen, no longer a secretary, but a manager of organizational transformation. It's a miracle, someone commented. No, Miriam gently corrected. It's hard work, difficult choices, and the courage to do things differently. Miracles happen instantly. Real transformation takes time. As the night ended and the guests dispersed, Miriam and Robert were once again alone on the terrace, watching the lights of the city they had helped transform, at least in part. Was it worth it? Miriam asked, though she already knew the answer. Every tear, every loss, every difficult moment, Robert replied without hesitation, because in the end I gained something that all the money in the world could not buy. What? The ability to sleep in peace, to look in the mirror without shame, to know that my time in this world will leave more than ruins disguised as success. Miriam smiled, the same enigmatic smile from the beginning, but now filled with genuine affection. Then we did it. We did what? Proved that the story does not have to end as it began. that endings can be rewritten, that beggars can be masters and millionaires can learn humility. As St. Paul slept around them, two people who had started on opposite sides of a social chasm contemplated the bridge they had built together. A bridge made not of concrete and steel, but of understanding, sincere remorse, and transformative action. The aroma of the next morning's coffee would find them not in separate worlds, but working side by side to ensure that other Marinas would not have to lose everything to be heard, and that other Robertos could learn before it was too late. The beggar who transformed the life of a millionaire had done much more than that. She had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after they were gone. And Robert, the transformed millionaire, had discovered that true wealth lay not in what is accumulated, but in what is sown for the future. In the last entry of the journal that Miriam had kept since her days on the streets, she wrote, "Today I complete not just a journey of personal justice, but the proof that systems can change when people choose to change." Robert was not the only one transformed we all were, and that is the true victory. Robert, in turn, kept framed in his office, no longer on the isolated 40th floor, but on the accessible ground level, a photo of the park bench where Miriam used to sit. Below it, a simple plaque. "Here began my true education." And so, in a city known for its brutal contrasts, two lives intertwined by fate prove that bridges can be built even over the deepest chasms when there is courage to acknowledge mistakes and wisdom to choose a better path. The end.